back in session. We now need to deal with routine motions, and Mr. Fragiscatos, you have some that have been distributed, as I understand it.
That's correct, Mr. Chair. I'll just begin one by one, if I could. The first of these routine motions is as follows. It pertains to analysts. That the committee retain as needed and at the discretion of the chair the services of one or more analysts from the Library of Parliament to assist in its work.
In each case, I say, is it agreed? Is it agreed?
Yes.
Agreed. Agreed.
The Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure. That the Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedure be established and be composed of 6 members, the chair, the 3 vice chairs, the parliamentary secretary, and 1 other member from the government.
Mr. Albus.
Mr. Chair, and congratulations on your election, and it's a pleasure to serve with everyone here. I certainly believe that we need to have routine motions. I would like to propose a small change, so I propose the following amendment, that after the word vice chairs, comma, so after that, the parliamentary secretary and the semicolon is removed completely. So again, the removal of the comma, the parliamentary secretary, semicolon, and I'll be happy if you find the motion in order, Mr. Chair, to give rationale for. Oh, and the number. Pardon me. Okay. Pardon me. I've also been told that one would have to change also the number of committee members on the subcommittee.
From
so it would be from
5.
6 to 5.
The motion to amend, the motion is in order. Debate on the motion to amend. Mr. Albus.
Yes, I just think that the government, by having both the chair as well as having a member from the government side, they could choose a parliamentary secretary if they like. But in order to be able to have some a majority vote, if making a recommendation from the subcommittee back to this, it would probably be sufficient. With 6 members, you could end up with a split. So this would still allow the government to have its member, still would be able to decide whether it's a parliamentary secretary or not. I just don't believe that we should be giving, that there should be a 6-member subcommittee, and that the amendment should be by removing the parliamentary secretary.
Mr. Oliphant.
I don't think we will argue this too strenuously, but we want to point out just the arithmetic of this subcommittee. It's the intention is to mirror as closely as we can the makeup of the committee itself, the special committee on the subcommittee, which is already somewhat less proportionally towards the government side than the House of Commons, which the people of Canada elected. So when you look at the House of Commons as elected by the people of Canada, obviously there is a minority government. Obviously, we understand that we want to keep that same balance on this committee, as all our committees, as they're struck, will be maintaining. However, we think the number of 6 is actually quite fair and quite good. The reality of the arithmetic of it is that when that committee meets, there will be 3 members of the opposition and 2 members on the government side. So it's 3 to 2, with the chair obviously on the committee, however, not voting unless there's a tie. And if there's a tie, that allows the full members of the opposition to be engaged in this, as opposed to just the official opposition. That the other opposition parties then are able to express their desire as well, and be equally accorded a position on this subcommittee. We think it's actually very fair to ensure that we have representatives of all the parties with the weight that is important. So we would be arguing that having 2 members of the government, 3 members of the opposition, and a chair who will not be able to sway the vote if all the opposition are on one side and the government's on the other side, even if it's not going to happen that we can have a tie unless one of the opposition parties supports another party. And so we think it's a fairer representation of the results of the last election as indicated by the House of Commons. And we think it affords an opportunity for the smaller parties to be fairly represented on the subcommittee.
Mr. Albus?
Yes, I certainly appreciate the members' remarks, but two things. First of all, let's put in perspective that the subcommittee really is there for scheduling, and any kind of decision from that body would have to be ratified by ours. So at the end of the day, we are, as committee members, full committee members on this committee, are always going to get our way. But I also would point out that from speaking from people that have served in previous minority parliaments, that the practice for a subcommittee was 5 members, not 6. And so we don't need to reinvent the wheel. We are going to be productive on this committee. We just don't believe that a parliamentary secretary needs to be named specifically to that. A parliamentary secretary can be named as a member of the government, or someone else can. It's the pleasure of the government to decide who will serve on that subcommittee. I would just ask all members who believe that it should be 5 to vote in favor of that resolution, and we can get on to the work of the rest of the committee.
Okay. Seeing no one else wishing to speak, I'll call Mr. Oliphant.
A question I would have, and I think would be a very important concept, is a clear declaration by the official opposition that their intention is to work by consensus in this subcommittee as opposed to by voting. And if we had an understanding that the opposition was in favor of all work being done at the subcommittee being by consensus, and that reports being made to the full committee were done by a consensus decision, then we would have no difficulty whatsoever with 5. But I have not heard from the opposition that they are actually willing to work it by consensus. So if I could get that statement clearly recorded, that will be our working mandate for the subcommittee, then we will not have a problem with that.
Mr. Albus.
I don't mean to belabor this to the committee, but again, whatever the subcommittee decides must be ratified by this body. Whether there was consensus or not, if there's not a consensus at this committee, the full committee, it will not proceed. And I also would remind the member that if consensus could be had with 2 Liberals in addition to the chamber, or the chair, then you can get consensus with 1. Just make sure that person is eloquent and reasonable.
Mr. Oliphant.
What I have asked for is a clear statement from the official opposition that they're prepared to work in consensus at the subcommittee. If I have a clear statement on the record that they are prepared to work in consensus, we will support the amendment.
Mr. Albus, I see.
All I can simply say, without knowing the members, I'm not going to tie members' hands, whether they be the official opposition or other opposition members or the government. Democracy is how we get things done when people don't agree. So I would just leave it to those members. I have faith that they'll be able to do it, especially if there's 5.
Monsieur Bergeron, et après ça, Monsieur Oliphant.
Mr. Chair, to respond to our colleague's request, I would answer that for our part, every member of this committee can rest assured that for our part, we are going to work in full cooperation with all political parties. I do not believe, and I insist on this, I do not believe that this committee is the appropriate place for partisan struggles. I think that the goal of this committee is to explore ways to improve the relationship between Canada and China. I think that we must absolutely work in a spirit of cooperation. If that is what our colleague, Mr. Oliphant, is asking, I can assure him that I will be fully cooperative.
Bien sûr, merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. We agree with the same sentiment. The spirit of cooperation in all of our work here. However, I think it is also necessary to have something appropriate for all parties at the committee and the subcommittee as well. I think that there's a feeling that we do want to cooperate together. However, we also need to have all of the parties demonstrate their commitment to exactly that same thing, to exactly what you said.
Seeing no other speakers, yeah, that's right, we have before us the motion to amend, and I think members are familiar with what the motion to amend says, so I will call for the vote. Those in favor of the motion to amend, please signify by raising your hands. Toutes qui sont en faveur de motion doivent.
All those in favor of the motion, please raise their hand.
Qui sont opposés.
All those who are opposed to the motion.
I didn't see the hand of Mr. Bergeron. J'ai pas vu la main de Mr. Bergeron.
I didn't see Mr. Bergeron's hand. I think I was talking when you called the vote. However, in the spirit of what Mr. Oliphant explained, personally, I would be fine with one or other of the options as long as everything is done in a spirit of cooperation. I see that I have the deciding vote. Therefore, I will support my colleagues on the opposition side.
The amendment is carried.
The amendment, I'm sorry, the motion to amend is carried, yes. So the motion is now amended, and now we're back to the main motion as amended in the fashion as you've heard.
Looks great.
Any further discussion on the motion as amended? Seeing none. Mr. Oliphant.
I would like to further amend the motion. And after the new period, which it would then change to a comma and say, and that the subcommittee on agenda and procedure will work in a process of consensus decision making.
Madame Alislev.
Debate.
Yes. On debate, yeah.
Okay, so can you give us an idea of what the definition, what you see as meaning consensus?
Mr. Oliphant.
By me, consensus means we will work as a committee for the best interests of the tasks at hand, the 5 mandates that have been given to this committee, and that the committee will work to ensure that they will present a unified voice to this body, which will then vote on it and agree or not agree, but that we strike very early in this process a collaborative spirit, and that we work by consensus to attempt to find our meeting schedules, our meeting times, our witness lists, when we choose to have a report or not a report or an interim report, that if we can work that out by consensus in the subcommittee, I think the work of this committee, even if it comes to a vote and it is overturned in this committee, I think that establishes a routine way of working that if we can get those 5 people to agree on something, we will have better work and Canadians will be better served.
Okay. I have Ms. Alislev, Ms. Blaney, and Mr. Albus. Ms. Alislev.
Pour exprimer encore une fois les sentiments.
Again, to echo the sentiments of my colleague on the opposition, we always work in a spirit of cooperation, and we can speak with a unanimous voice for our colleagues and fellow members. However, making an amendment on the routine motions to indicate that we can't express both sides of an issue when we go back to the full committee is difficult. And I don't believe that's the intention of a subcommittee or a committee. We're going to discuss things. We will try to establish a consensus, but if we cannot, that this is a situation that is so important and so critical. We need to discuss it, and we want to have the opportunity to reiterate and to say both sides of the issue to the full committee. That means I cannot support writing this in black and white into the routine motions. However, we will try to work with that intention nonetheless.
Thank you, Chair, and congratulations on being appointed to this very important role on this very important committee. I appreciate the discussion that's happening right now. I understand that we're in a minority government. I've never done this before, so I have a lot to learn, and I'm excited to do so. And I believe also that at the end of the day, Canadians are sending us to this place to work together collaboratively to get things done. So I have a great appreciation for that. What I'm curious about, though, is this the usual practice? I've never seen this before brought forward in routine proceedings, and this is only my second term. Is this something that's happened before? Is this something that is more reflective in a minority government? I just need a little bit more information before I make my decision.
Mr. Albus.
Thank you. And I also agree that Canadians do want parliamentarians to work together, particularly on a committee that's supposed to be rather germane in terms of scheduling. So I personally don't believe we need to have it. In fact, the one committee that does operate by consensus in this place is actually the Joint Standing Committee for the Scrutiny of Regulations, which is both the House of Commons and with the Senate. And members do work in consensus. But the problem is that if there is no consensus, and I've been on some of those meetings, you will go around for an hour on a simple, should it be a comma or should it be a semicolon, if there cannot be a reasonable way to decide how to move forward. And that's by democratic vote. So I would just suggest that if the Liberals are truly concerned about consensus building at the subcommittee, that they send someone who is reasonable, and that has reasonable, not just reasonable decorum, but also brings forward proposals that people can get around. That's how you get people to agree, is by listening, and by doing that, you don't need to put that on a piece of paper. You just need to do it. I would suggest to this group, let's carry on. Let's let the subcommittee form. Let's see how they do. If someone is not behaving and not getting things done or being a block, you either have a vote or you come back to this committee and say, we're not working well, send us some new members, and we'll do that.
Have Mr. Fragiscalis, après ça, Monsieur Bergeron.
I just bring to the committee's attention, and this is to Ms. Blaney's point, but it also speaks to what Mr. Albus just said. There is, in fact, a precedent for what Mr. Oliphant has put forward, which I think is very reasonable. But it's not as if it's seeking to establish a precedent as far as how subcommittees work. The subcommittee on the Foreign Affairs Committee is the International Human Rights Committee, which has operated throughout its history by consensus, exactly along the lines of how Mr. Oliphant has described. So I don't see why we can't follow towards a path of consensus. In the way that we've heard here, I think this is an opportunity to work collaboratively in a way that that Canadians would expect. And I go back and say that this exists. We have a subcommittee. I know Mr. Albus just talked about a committee of Parliament, but it's more apropos in my mind that we look at what precedent could exist on a subcommittee level in this Parliament, and that's the Subcommittee on International Human Rights, which, as I say, has operated by consensus. And I don't believe that principle has been broken for at least 10 years. My memory could be wrong on this, but it operates on consensus very, very well, and I think we could do the same here.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Chair, I want to express my concerns. This is the second routine motion, and we're already having trouble coming to an agreement. If we are serious about our willingness to work together in a spirit of cooperation and consensus, we're going to have to find ways to do it more easily. Personally, I didn't really have any trouble with the word consensus, in the sense that consensus is not necessarily unanimous. As long as we clearly distinguish between consensus and unanimity, I have no problem with it. I interpreted consensus as presented by Mr. Oliphant a spirit of cooperation. Now I feel that we're in a situation where we're going to have to throw out the baby with the bathwater. I do not like it at all. I don't know if, in a spirit of cooperation, Mr. Oliphant would be open to the idea of replacing consensus with a spirit of cooperation in order to avoid losing everything.
We're now au débat maintenant.
We are now debating the motion moved by Mr. Bergeron, the sub-amendment moved by Mr. Bergeron. My apologies. And I recognize Mr. Oliphant.
Je suis d'accord.
I agree.
Absolutely fine to have that there. I think that it is obviously clear to me that there's a difference between unanimity and consensus. Consensus generally means I may not agree with it, but I can live with it. That is what has been my history. My history comes from the United Church of Canada, and we work on a consensus model, and we've done that for the last 35 years. And it means that we work towards something and we reach an opinion, we share an opinion, we hear each other, and yet we may not agree with it, but we can live with it, and we present it as such to the broader committee. Ms. Blaney's comments, the subcommittees I have actually worked on, both in public safety and national security, as well as citizenship and immigration, as chairs of those committees, we did not take votes. We worked until we could reach an agreement, and I think that is something that is very good to do. However, I can also live with the sense of in a spirit of collaboration. That is also fine with me. So I would be supporting Mr. Bergeron's sub-amendment to change that from consensus to in a spirit of collaboration.
So my question is, do we have further debate on this sub-amendment question?
I just wanted clarity on the wording and if
Okay.
it's in the spirit of collaboration.
So what Mr. Bergeron proposed was to remove the words, the word consensus with, actually the words, I think, consensus decision-making would say the subcommittee will work in a spirit of collaboration. That's the key change, okay? So, Mr. Albus.
Yeah, I would just support that, but I would imagine anyone who we send as a vice chair or a designate from the government would be looking to work with each other on our planning. So I really don't think the juice is worth the squeeze here, but I do appreciate that my colleague has actually improved Mr. Oliphant's original intent. So I will be supporting the block of
Is there further debate on the proposed sub-amendment? Seeing none, I'll call for the vote. Those in favor, sont en faveur,
All those in favor?
unanimously. It's carried. The sub-amendment is in the spirit of collaboration. Sub-amendment motion to amend was proposed. Yes, was passed unanimously. Now we are back to the main motion. Any further debate on the main motion as amended? Is it the sub-amendment? Sorry, are we back to, where are we exactly?
To the whole.
Yeah, the whole thing. Good. We are back to the whole motion as amended. Any further debate on the motion as amended? Seeing none, those in favor signify by raising your hands. Contrary minded, I see none. Motion unanimously carried. We're off to a great start. All right. Mr. Prajaskaras, I think we're back to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This routine motion relates to reduced quorum. That the chair be authorized to hold meetings to receive evidence and to have that evidence printed when a quorum is not present, provided that at least 4 members are present, including 1 member of the opposition, 1 member of the government, but when traveling outside the parliamentary precinct, that the meeting begin after 15 minutes, regardless of members present.
Any discussion of this motion? Seeing none, is it agreed? Agreed.
Okay.
Mr. Fragiskalis.
The questioning of witnesses. That witnesses be given 10 minutes for their opening statement. That, at the discretion of the chair, during the questioning of witnesses, there be allocated 6 minutes for the first questioner of each party as follows. Round 1, Conservative Party, followed by the Liberal Party, followed by the Bloc Québécois, followed by the New Democratic Party. For the second and subsequent rounds, the order and time for questioning will be as follows, Mr. Chair. Conservative Party 5, and that thereafter 5 minutes. Liberal Party 5 minutes, Conservative Party 5 minutes, Liberal Party 5 minutes, Bloc Québécois 2.5 minutes, New Democratic Party 2.5 minutes.
Comments? Is it a debate? Mr. Doherty?
Mr. Chair, I just have a question just in regarding to number of witnesses per meeting. I know on other committees when we have been jammed up with witnesses and the availability of witnesses that, and it's not preferred that we reduce the amount of time to 7 minutes, or do we extend the meeting? Just given that we may have a number of witnesses per meeting, and that may jam up the entire meeting. So do we want to deal with the number of witnesses per meeting that we'll be calling, or?
Well, that's a question you're asking the whole committee, I think, and that could conceivably be a separate motion, I think, a separate, or a matter for the subcommittee for that matter. But who do we have next? Mr. Albus.
Yeah, Mr. Chair, I certainly think that obviously it's a new parliament, so I think that we start with this. If there begins to be a big issue, then we can always move a motion at some later point to amend our routine proceedings. But I'm satisfied that we can try it out, and if it serves the committee well, then we'll go with that.
Okay. Monsieur Bergeron.
Comme on dirait dans le domaine.
As we would say in IT, I think that it's the default setting. As mentioned, we could find ourselves in a situation where we have a little less time, or other situations. For example, when the Prime Minister appears, I would not want to limit the Prime Minister to 10 minutes if he wanted to take more time. How are we going to manage that amongst ourselves? I think that we can discuss it now to avoid coming to an impasse in case the situation requires us to modify this basic rule.
Mr. Oliphant.
My understanding is that we have generally on parliamentary committees worked, if there is unanimous consent around the table, to move away from the routine proceedings. It is done by a meeting-by-meeting, case-by-case situation. And so what would happen would be the chair would test whether or not the committee, if there are two panels happening the same meeting, instead of 2 10s, the chair and the clerk may offer advice to the committee that they take 7 or 7.5 minutes. If there's only one that the committee want to hear from, they may suggest to the committee we want 15 minutes. And I have never experienced that as a problem in committees, that generally the discretion of the chair and the clerk, and there's almost always just a nodding off of the committee members as they make that decision. I have always seen that as not difficult. In the routine motions, we set the rounds. We're attempting in this motion to say that the government party takes 33% of the time, the Conservative Party, the official opposition, gets 33% of the time, and the NDP and the Bloc each get 17% of the time. I think the government is showing generosity in allowing more time for the opposition than for the government side, and I think that is the routine proceeding. When we get into meeting by meeting, case by case, then we trust the chair and the clerk to advise our committee, and then we will agree or not agree. But that's, I think, at the discretion of the chair.
Any further? Monsieur Bergeron, votre commentaire.
Je me sens l'obligation de.
I feel obliged to come back to this point. I understand what Mr. Oliphant is saying. However, I do remember some situations where the government party was less cooperative when it was time, for example, to ask questions of the Prime Minister. I'm of the opinion that 10 minutes for the Prime Minister is not enough. I am of the opinion that for opposition parties, the time listed here to ask questions of the Prime Minister might not be enough. I do not want to find ourselves in a situation where we make a request to increase the amount of time and we are denied.
Mr. Fraziskatos.
I hope we can find, to get back to that word consensus here on the issue, but I think that it would be wise perhaps to send this matter to the subcommittee to look at. When it comes to how we witness time and these sorts of things, that's not unimportant. It's very important, but it's a matter specifically for the subcommittee to work out and look at. At least that's been my experience. Those matters are usually brought to the subcommittee's attention.
Mr. Oliphant and then Mr. Albus.
I was going to say the same thing, that in my experience on committees, we use this as our standard, as our base, and then as it needs to change, we need to change. I think if the subcommittee is working well, and often this won't even go to the subcommittee, the chair and the clerk will advise us, and we'll make a very quick decision at the beginning of a meeting. We're expecting to have significant witnesses. We'll have other meetings with lengthy briefings. We're going to have lots of work to do. So I would like to take this as a start. And then if the subcommittee on agenda is looking at various meetings, they may recommend to the whole committee we make specific changes for meetings, but also think that the chair's job is to manage our time to make it most effective.
Mr. Albus. Okay. Any further comments on this motion? Seeing none, is it agreed? I guess is what I should ask before taking it to a vote. Is it agreed? Agreed. Agreed. Okay. Thank you. Mr. Fraziskatos.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. On documents distribution, that the clerk of the committee be authorized to distribute documents to members of the committee only when the documents are available in both official languages, and that the witnesses be advised accordingly.
Is it agreed? Agreed. Mr. Fraziskatos.
Working meals, that the clerk of the committee be authorized to make the necessary arrangements to provide working meals for the committee and its subcommittee, so we don't starve.
Is it agreed? Agreed.
Agreed.
Mr. Fraziskatos.
Witnesses' expenses, that if requested, reasonable travel, accommodation, and living expenses be reimbursed to witnesses, not exceeding 2 representatives per organization, provided that, in exceptional circumstances, payment for more representatives be made at the discretion of the chair.
Is it agreed? Agreed. Mr. Albus.
Just on this point, Mr. Chair, I would hope, though, simply because there could be a very wide, worldwide footprint on the work of this committee, that we try to use Skype and some of the technology that taxpayers have so availed of us.
Video conferencing, et cetera.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. So I think it's agreed then? Agreed. Mr. Fraziskatos.
Staff at in-camera meetings, that unless otherwise ordered, each committee member be allowed to have 1 staff member at an in-camera meeting, and that one additional person from each House officer's office be allowed to be present.
Is it agreed? Agreed. Mr. Fraziskatos.
In-camera meetings transcripts, that 1 copy of the transcript of each in-camera meeting be kept in the committee clerk's office for consultation by members of the committee or by their staff.
Is it agreed? Agreed.
Finally, notice of motions, and this one is fairly lengthy, Mr. Chair, that a 48 hours notice interpreted as 2 nights shall be required for any substantive motion to be considered by the committee unless the substantive motion relates directly to business then under consideration, provided that the notice be filed with the clerk of the committee no later than 4 p.m. from Monday to Friday, that 2, the motion be distributed to members in both official languages by the clerk on the same day the said notice was transmitted, if it was received no later than the deadline hour, and that 3, notices received after the deadline hour or on non-business days be deemed to have been received during the business day, and that when the committee is traveling on official business, no substantive motions may be moved.
Your notice, or your motions, you left out the word next. I think you meant during the next business day.
Excuse me. Yes, during the next business day, yes.
Thank you. Mr. Albus.
As a British Columbian, I'm always keenly aware of Pacific Standard Time versus Eastern Standard Time. So I'm
Naturally.
assuming that, just so that we have clarity, that it's Eastern Standard Time, the 4 o'clock cutoff.
That's my yes. That would,
Perhaps
Unless there's a
if the chair
different view
wills
on
it,
that.
it can just be done as a friendly amendment.
I
Just
think that's-
because, I would love it to be Pacific Standard Time. But
Is there any, that's fine, that's fine. So so we'll consider it Eastern Time. Yes, the time here in Ottawa, okay. Is it agreed? Is this agreed? Agreed?
Yes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Fadjiskatis. That concludes your...
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you, or in Greek, Efristopoli. Mr. Doherty.
To move forward with is that all meetings other than those deemed in camera be televised.
I'm advised that if the agreement, your motion should be advised to say if possible, because there are times when there are two meetings at the same time. Or sorry, only two meetings at a time can be televised. But we can also do webcast, by the way. Yeah. So regardless of whether or not we can televise, we can certainly do a webcast. So, but when possible. So I think the idea being that. So what I'm proposing to you is that the motion be all meetings other than those deemed in camera be televised or webcast if possible, and when possible.
Or webcast,
Well,
because
yeah,
we
when
can have.
So it says televised or webcast when possible, right? And my understanding is that, as far as I know, unless you've got a major problem with the internet, it's always possible to webcast. The real question is that sometimes it's not possible to televise. Madame Alislev.
Okay, so let's just clarify that, because is it an either or? So
I see.
I don't know. So maybe
Right.
we want it always webcast and always televised when possible.
I'm told that it should be, so I guess that it should be one or the other, I'm told, in terms of the way the place works, and therefore the priority, so that I think what you want to say, if you permit me, is that all meetings other than those deemed in camera will be televised, or if that is not possible, then webcast.
Correct.
Does that work? Okay. That works for you? Is it agreed? Agreed. Thank you. And we're on to Ms. Allison. Okay. I think, so does that conclude our routine proceedings, the routine motions, I think? Okay. Ms. Allison, you wish to have the floor?
So if possible, Mr. Chair, I would like to put forward a motion that everyone should have received in advance, that the committee invite the Ambassador of Canada to the People's Republic of China, Mr. Dominic Barton, to appear in person before the committee for a 2-hour televised meeting on Monday, January 27th, 2020, and that Mr. Barton be given 20 minutes to update the committee on the state of relations between Canada and the People's Republic of China, and that the remaining time be allotted for questions and comments from members of the committee.
Okay. I'm going to ask that in the future that members make sure to submit any notices of motion to the clerk. I understand this was not submitted to the clerk, but I think members may be agreeable to, and nevertheless, to having this. Mr. Oliphant?
I'm happy to. Ms. Alsop, would you like to explain the motion, or I can?
See if there's debate or you want me to?
I think we'll let you, he sounds like he would like you to
Okay, perfect.
make the case. So.
Make the case,
So-
and then I'll respond.
So, in order for us to determine what exactly we want to study first and how we want this committee to prioritize the information that we want to study, I think we need to hear from Canada's representative, the diplomat and the person that is the point man on our relationship with China as an opening story. so that we can understand the status of where the relationship is on all aspects, and to understand the government's direction to the ambassador on what the government strategy is towards China. So it's such a critical witness, and will help us even before we get to our subcommittee meeting to determine what precisely we want to study, to understand what the status is, what the lay of the land is from Canada's man on the ground, as they say, so that we can identify not only where the situation is at the moment in an informed and timely way, but also what the government's direction is to the ambassador in terms of how our country is approaching China. So that's why we're advocating for it to be the first witness, so that it can inform everything that we do and ask afterwards, and why, because it is such a time-sensitive thing, that we would like it to be as soon as possible, i.e. when the House resumes next Monday. Thank you.
Okay, j'ai M. Oliphant. Après ça, M. Bergeron.
Thank you very much for this. I want to state the position on this side of the table very clearly, that we are absolutely in favor of calling Dominic Barton, the ambassador of Canada to the People's Republic of China, as an early witness. We think that it is critical to hear from Mr. Barton, and we think that his insights will be helpful for the committee and important for us to do at a very early stage in this study. However, we also recognize that we are not all at the same level of experience or knowledge with respect to the issues that we have been assigned by the House of Commons to study. We've been asked to look at, but not limit ourselves to, consular, economic, legal, security, and the diplomatic relations that we have with the People's Republic. We think to do that effectively and to ask the best questions, because asking good questions is part of our role as members of Parliament, it would be more helpful if in the first one or two meetings we had briefings from officials that could help lay the groundwork and bring everyone up to speed on the most recent issues that we have been facing. They could be officials from Global Affairs Canada, from Foreign Affairs, which also include international trade. They could be issues from the public safety and emergency preparedness. They could be anybody we else decide that would help us understand these issues clearly and more effectively to ask better questions. As the parliamentary secretary to the former minister and now to the current minister, I've had tremendous opportunities both to travel to China but also to have briefings from our officials. I have found that those briefings are valuable. They're insightful. I won't say I agree with everything that I ever hear in a briefing. That's my nature. But they help me to do my job better. And I think we have one of the best public services in the world. Our public servants are both effective as well as efficient. And I think this committee would be well served to have those as our first meetings. And then our first witness be Mr. Barton. So we could. I am absolutely in agreement with the sentiment of the motion that he be our first witness that we hear from. However, I think as Parliament resumes, it is absolutely important for us to all get on the same page, to have a variety of knowledge levels kind of equalized, and it's unfair that the government side could have more knowledge than the opposition side because we have that access to briefings. This is the same as every parliamentary committee that I have been engaged in that undertakes a study. When you undertake a study, you ask your Library of Parliament analysts to prepare briefing materials, but you also ask officials to come in and present the topic. I think every committee I've been on that is engaged in a significant study has done that kind of work. Often then, either the minister would come either at the beginning or the end of the study. I think in this case, it would be an excellent idea to have our ambassador come, but we will be suggesting that to do that on Monday, January 27th is a week or two premature to allow us to have 2 or 3 meetings to do that kind of work. Again, I think that we take this to the agenda, the subcommittee on agenda, let them really wrestle with what kind of briefings would be effective and important to the committee and helpful, and then go from there to bring a recommendation on that to the committee at its next meeting, and very quickly get going. We recognize that this is an important study. We also recognize that the motion as presented by Mr. O'Toole did not put an end date in terms of when we're required to report. That was suggested by the NDP, by Mr. Harris, that we actually have an end date. And I think that because we don't have an end date, we're not urgently rushed to get this work done in the first week. Let's take our time. Let's do it well. I'm also very aware of Mr. Bergeron's comments in his speech with respect to this motion, where he was in agreement with the whole motion, but had concern about portion K of the actual motion, and to make sure that we don't go down a political theater moment at that first meeting. I think it would be in the spirit of what Mr. Bergeron said, that we would actually hear from experts and officials, not experts, our officials first, to give us that. What I would be suggesting to the subcommittee, just to give you a heads up, would be that we get an update on the general diplomatic relations, and so we're all aware of what has transpired in the recent months, what has transpired with respect to the consular cases, not only Mr. Spavor and Mr. Kovrig, but any other consular cases that might be of concern to the committee, to make sure we do it carefully. What public security issues that we should be aware of before we engage too much into our work, because this is a matter of, I think, a very extremely important national security as well, and that well-being of specific Canadians in detention in China need to be considered alongside the well-being of Canadian businesses doing important agricultural business and other business in Canada, and also the people-to-people relationships that we enjoy between Canada and China. So I'm saying we're in agreement with the motion. We think that the timeline of January 27th is not appropriate, that we should have 2 or 3 briefings before we do that. Delay it a week or 2 is all I'm suggesting, to allow the committee to do its work well and carefully and ask the best questions possible. Thank you.
Monsieur Bergeron.
Monsieur le Président, vous me permettrez.
Mr. Chair, I would like to tell Mr. Oliphant just how well he represented my own thoughts on the matter. That said, I do believe that this is an extremely relevant motion. However, it may not be appropriate at this particular moment. I do not contest in any way the relevance of asking the ambassador of Canada to China to come before this committee to present his version or his analysis of the situation. However, it must be recognized that despite the intrinsic qualities of the ambassador of Canada to China, the position was vacant for 8 months. For 8 months during this long crisis, the position of an ambassador was left vacant by the Liberal government. Perhaps we need to know why this position was vacant for 8 months before summoning the person who holds that position. I agree with Mr. Oliphant that it would be worthwhile to hear from representatives of the Department of Foreign Affairs and to obtain an analysis by the library. And we just created a subcommittee to determine what our agenda will be. This proposal, although it is highly relevant, I think it's a bit premature because we still need to organize the work of this committee before throwing ourselves in headfirst into a meeting that might not be well prepared with the Ambassador of Canada to Beijing. I think it is important to meet the Ambassador of Canada to Beijing, but it is very important to be extremely well prepared for that meeting that we're going to have with this ambassador. And I do not believe that 1 week's time will give us enough time to do constructive work for this meeting with the Ambassador of Canada to China.
Ms. Ollislev.
Well, thank you very much. And first and foremost, I would like to say that certainly we, on the official opposition side, are highly sensitive to the individuals who are wrongfully imprisoned in China, and to not doing anything that would in any way put their release at peril. So that is not the goal of us wanting to have the ambassador come. We are sensitive to that, and we understand the incredible work that's being done there, but that we don't want to do anything to jeopardize that. However, we do want to hear from the ambassador. He is the most senior official. He is an official of the Government of Canada, and he is the most senior official, and he is Canada's voice that isn't elected. Obviously, a minister, and so therefore he should be able to speak on all things, and regardless of the information that we have, he should be able to give us the information that he gives around the world, and certainly in China and to other people. So we are asking for a briefing for him to give us an overview of all aspects of the consular, diplomatic, trade, security, as it applies to his position. And we want to have that sooner rather than later, so that it can inform us when we do go into the deep dive on the other things. It is our intention that we have the opportunity to study all of those areas, and we will hear from officials who will give us more information in each one of those areas. But without having a clear overview of the government's strategy towards the relationship with China, which would come from the ambassador, as well as a current update on the status of that relationship, that is the responsibility of the ambassador to be able to advise us on. We won't be able to know which officials to call and what information to do a deep dive on later. And so, yes, there is a sense of urgency because the relationship is deteriorating, and we as a committee would like to be able to do some homework and provide recommendations so that we can ensure that the relationship doesn't deteriorate anymore, and that we are able to protect both national security interests, economic interests, and diplomatic interests of Canada. Thank you.
Ms. Blaney.
Well, thank you for this very interesting conversation on something that is incredibly important and very urgent, and I agree with that. And having the point person here talking to the committee is really key in moving forward. I'm just curious, if there's a lot of briefing information that needs to be given, with the sense of urgency, is there not a reason why some of that work can't be done quickly so that this week even, so that we can move forward? Again, urgency is key here. I don't think that, when this motion came to the House, that anybody would have said this is something we can take a lot of time, learning. We need to get on point. I'm very supportive of this motion. I think we need the ambassador here as the point person, not the point man necessarily, to update us. And I think a lot of us would appreciate the briefing material as soon as possible so that we can get up to speed.
Mr. Fragiskatos.
No one around the table, certainly not on this side, but no one around the table is disagreeing with the need to bring the ambassador so the ambassador can shed light on the situation. We can ask questions, but there's an obligation. And granted, this point has been made, but I speak individually here as a member. I feel much more comfortable questioning the ambassador after a briefing so that the proper foundation can be established, so we can talk to our officials about what is going on and understand more about all of those issues. And to the point that Ms. Blaney just raised, I think that our officials also need time to adequately prepare as well. Yes, granted, they're working on the issue and have been for some time, but let's establish an order of operations here that makes sense. And I don't think immediately leading with the ambassador, it's just putting the cart before the horse, quite frankly, Mr. Chair.
Mr. Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I want to start off by saying that I really appreciate Mr. Oliphant's comments. Having spent over a decade working in China, I know the nuances and the sensitivities around certain issues. But I do want to remind those, or perhaps enter this into the conversation, that any time that we were going to go in country, do work within the provinces or the country of China, we were briefed as officials of Canada by the senior most official on the ground. And I think it would behoove this committee that we start with the senior most official on the ground, who is the most familiar with all the geopolitical sensitivities that we have, and who informs the other officials. As we move forward throughout this committee, it is going to be very important that we have that information in advance of us questioning other officials, so that we understand the sensitivities and the security issues that may arise from our line of questioning. That can only come from the ambassador. I think it's very important that we start this committee off on the right foot, which would be bringing the senior most official here. It's no different than any other time when we do business with China. We are briefed by the senior most official on the ground so that we understand our work as we move forward. And to Mr. Bergeron's comments, this will then form our agenda as we move forward into a subcommittee, because then, as was mentioned earlier, in the spirit of cooperation or consensus, we can agree on the areas of concern and those that we want to bring before this committee moving forward.
Mr. Barrett.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. So I'm in violent agreement with my colleague, Mr. Doherty. However, I appreciate the comments of Mr. Oliphant and Mr. Bergeron and Ms. Blaney. And that being said, I do believe that that Canadians expect to hear from that ambassador, and that's why we've started laying the groundwork for televised meetings. The committee has been constituted, and we're here before the House resumes after the Christmas break. And I do believe that we should hear from the ambassador next week. However, to the points of my colleagues on having some briefings in advance, I think Ms. Blaney's point about having those briefings this week would satisfy all of the concerns that have been expressed, so that we do act quickly and hear from our first witness, being the ambassador, next week. But in the meantime, having the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs provide a briefing to the regular members of this committee this week, to have the National Security Advisor provide a briefing to regular members of the committee this week, then we would be well informed and have the full suite of information available to those departments that they represent, and the information that they provide to the government would be available to the members of the committee. And then when we hear from our top official on this file, our ambassador, then we have all of that information, and the concerns have been satisfied, because members of Parliament are seized with this issue. They've been engaged. They have done work, and I'm confident that the level of commitment that colleagues here have given to this issue, that they are prepared to do the work and to hear from those officials as soon as possible so that we can get down to the work that the House has instructed us to do, because that's what Canadians expect. So I don't think that it needs to be one or the other. I think, in fact, we can do both, and we can hear from those important officials, the Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs and the National Security Advisor this week, provided they are in country. And I know that the ambassador has said that he has corresponded with Ms. Alislev and said that he is eager to appear. So as Canadians are eager to hear from him, and the regular members of this committee would be eager to ask questions of him following his testimony. Thank you.
Mr. Albus.
Yeah, thank you. And Mr. Barrett has kind of struck a couple of different ideas with myself. First of all, I'd like just to address Mr. Oliphant's key points, that some parliamentarians are disadvantaged because they don't have access to the government, such as government members or parliamentary secretaries. Yep, there is an imbalance. But that being said, that's why parliamentary committees are separate from government. We have analysts who, I'm sure, for members who, miraculously cannot find the time after being named to this committee. I've already taken out a few different books so that I can at least have a cursory understanding of all the different issues. I read them, many of the media that are here today, many of their columns that are informing of what the issues are. And I think I can find up questions, but if not, if a member feels disadvantaged and doesn't feel that they'll have questions at the starting of this committee's work, the Library of Parliament analysts will be able to supply them with good material that will help us to kind of get a good sense of it. Whether or not, perhaps, maybe if I could, because members opposite have not moved to amend, because they don't seem to agree. They agree that the ambassador is important. And from my understanding, the ambassador has actually shown interest in coming to the committee once it's ratified by members. But it's the dates that's a question, and then this power imbalance, or this information power imbalance, I think that Mr. Oliphant seems to be the issue. Perhaps what we do is just do a 3-hour meeting. Next Monday, we'll do an hour with, you mentioned the National Security Advisor, the acting one, as well as the Deputy Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade. And we'll start from there for the first hour, and then we'll have the ambassador. We also have to bear in mind that the ambassador may have something come up that needs to respond to, and it seems that, late January, he indicated that he'd be willing to come forward. So let's start working on this. I'm fine to manage my workload and to engage with the Library of Parliament so that I can be informed and I can ask good questions of Mr. Barton. And if you actually look at the original motion presented to the House that the House agreed with, from time to time we may call upon certain officials. That means that perhaps at another juncture we may have more questions because of what we've heard from various experts within Canada or outside. So this is not going to be a one-time process. Doesn't necessarily have to be. And my friend from the block had mentioned earlier about the subcommittee. That the process is now they're supposed to handle agenda. And I totally understand where he is. But we're the client, right? So we've hired the subcommittee, like a contractor, to handle certain things. But if we want to say we want a meeting to start with, just to open up the conversation and then let the members from that point start planning witnesses and the order of things, we can do that. And I don't find flaw with what he's said. I'm just pointing that you could also look at it from another perspective. And so I'm hopeful that members will be amenable to it, that perhaps the motion can be added where we also have the acting national security advisor and the deputy minister on the 27th. To me, that would be a good way where we can all just get started. And I trust that members will do their homework and I will do mine.
Mr. Albus's comments remind me that before we finish today, we should try, if we can, to deal with questions like the time of meetings, the usual meeting time, and the frequency of meetings. Mr. Oliphant.
Thank you. And I just repeat that there is absolutely no disagreement on this side that the first external witness be the ambassador of Canada to China. My experience may be different. than others. I recently traveled to 3 countries in Africa last week, and immediately upon arrival in each of those countries, I had very good briefings by the heads of mission in those countries. Absolutely, we trust our heads of mission, ambassadors, high commissioners, chargés d'affaires, to do the work of briefing us on the ground. However, before I left, I had extensive briefings from departmental officials, the desks in Global Affairs Canada, who brought up issues of consular affairs, international trade, investment, the issues that I would be encountering so that I could have an effective trip on behalf of the people of Canada. I think that that is the normal process that we engage in. We get written materials, and we have briefings from officials, and then we have the heads of our missions do that work. I am going to be in a moment presenting an amendment to the motion, but before I do that, I want to take us back to the 40th Parliament, and this is not the first time that we have had a special committee established by the House on an international issue. And the last time in the 40th Parliament was an international committee that was established to look at our our mission in Afghanistan. With all due respect to Ms. Blaney, we don't have Jack Harris here. His experience on that special committee, which lasted almost 3 years and had a number of reports, I think would be invaluable to our agenda committee. I think his experience on that committee, and I was serving with him on another committee at the same time, I think his understanding of the role of the briefings, the role of expert witnesses, the role of others who had differing opinions would be very helpful for us to consider at the agenda committee. We've just established an agenda subcommittee. I think we should use it. It needs to make some recommendations with respect to timings of our meetings, the number of meetings we have per week. Remember, this is not a standing committee that follows the normal slots of A, B, C, and D committees. We have to request our officials to appear. We have to we have an ambassador who is in China. We want him to be here as soon as possible, and we want to make the most effective use of his time and our time. This is something that we need to settle into. Parliament is just resuming next week. Most of us have other committee responsibilities. We want to get all of that fed into the agenda subcommittee so that every member can find a way into this committee to be most effective, and a meeting time, meeting frequency, our practical ways of working, I think would be best dealt with at a subcommittee on agenda. I just think it is an easier place than doing it here in this room. So I'm going to suggest an amendment to Ms. Alslev's motion. And it would read, the first 2 lines are the same. However, strike the words on Monday, January 27th, 2020. And then add at the end. So the motion will be reading as such, that the committee invite the Ambassador of Canada to the People's Republic of China, Mr. Dominic Barton, to appear in person before the committee for a 2-hour televised meeting. That Mr. Barton be given 20 minutes to update the committee on the state of relations between Canada and the People's Republic of China, and the remaining time be allotted for questions and comments from members of the committee. And that this meeting happen as soon as possible, after the subcommittee has met and the committee and the full committee has appropriately been briefed by officials as determined by the committee and subject to the scheduling by the clerk of the committee. I have it.
So
If you can read it. Erika can help. So if I can just speak to that motion, I think we are keeping the spirit of Ms. Alslev's motion to make sure that we have as immediate a meeting with Mr. Barton as possible, that we do it subject obviously to scheduling, but also subject to the work of the subcommittee getting together, determining and recommending to the committee what briefings would be appropriate, and to do that within the next couple of weeks. That's all. We are talking about a couple of weeks to make sure that we are organized. And that's what I have to say.
Thank you, Mr. Oliphant. We're now discussing the proposed amendment. I have Ms. Zan, Ms. Ollislev, and then Mr. Doherty.
Thank you very much. And it's a pleasure to be here and to meet everybody as a new member of Parliament. I want to say one of the reasons that I'm happy to be on this committee is because first and forefront in my mind and many of my constituents' minds is the safety of the 2 Canadians who are detained in China. And I think that we need to not let go of the reason why we're here and why we're talking about these very important issues. So I do want to hear from the ambassador. I also want to hear from experts. I'm perfectly willing to read as much information as anybody wants to send us, but I also want to see them in person and be able to ask questions in person. I think that time is of the essence, so I agree with everybody here on that. But having watched what can happen in these committees on television over the last year or so, I do not want to see this delve into and become a partisan, empty rhetoric fight among political parties over political points. So on that note, I would like to say that, yes, we need to see the ambassador. When that ambassador can come and see us is going to be up to all of us. It is a democracy after all. However, I'm very concerned and I do not want to see this become a political free-for-all. And I think it's important that we keep those 2 Canadians' safety first and foremost in our minds as we go about our deliberations. Thank you.
Ms. Ollislev.
Okay.
And Mr. Albus after Mr. Doherty.
So you do that. Okay. So my fear is that this sounds like an opportunity to put it further into the future and to not maybe address the sense of urgency that we have been trying to achieve with the motion. So I'm wondering how we might be able to ensure that there's a sense of urgency, not as soon as possible when the subcommittee meets and we've met with other people and, which could sound like sometime next century. So obviously we want this to happen sooner rather than later. Obviously we have somewhat of a disagreement on who should give us an overview first before taking a deep dive into each of the officials' areas of expertise. We understand the amendment that you're putting forward, and we do want, obviously, the subcommittee to be able to do their work. But how can we bound this so that it happens, I would say, in no less than a month to ensure that we keep the sense of urgency on it, but perhaps there's another way of arriving at a point where we could do it even more quickly than that.
Mr. Doherty.
Thank you, Mr. Chair.
May I just ask a point of order?
Point of order.
If it seems to me there was a suggestion, but I didn't hear a sub-amendment. And I'm just wondering whether there was a sub-amendment there or not. And that may be a way for us to get out of this quickly. If there was a sub-amendment coming from the suggested date, I think that would be acceptable. I have said 2 weeks. You said up to a month. I just think we may be able to get out of this very quickly if there was a sub-amendment.
Do you mind if I go back to Ms. Ollislev? Mr.
Okay.
Perhaps I have some information that maybe it might be pertinent to the committee, and perhaps a sub-amendment might come out of that. It is being reported that that Ambassador Barton is indeed in Winnipeg at the cabinet retreat currently with your colleagues. So he is in Canada, and we are here to work. To Lenore, to your comment, first and foremost, we must always be moving forward with that, the lives of Stavros and Kovrig. We have to. And time is of the essence, which is why we are saying and we've put forward the motion that that we speak to the most senior official who is informing our government and the rest of the officials on the sensitivities and the situation analysis that's on the ground. If he is indeed in Canada, well, I would offer this, that I think, again, we should confirm that, and we should move to try to get Ambassador Barton at the earliest convenience.
Can I allow Ms. Alislev to respond to Mr. Oliphant? And then Mr. Alduis.
Do you want to move this meeting and make a motion?
Then,
I think Mr. Albus can do two things at once here.
very good.
That's asking for
Many
a lot
more
from,
than that,
from,
I'm
He's
sure.
quite talented.
Yes, okay, well, thank you. Mr. Chair, I think I understand where members are coming from, so perhaps a sub-amendment would be helpful in this case, and I hope that it is, that the subcommittee meet no later than January 24th. The subcommittee can have, and at the call of the chair. So the committee can meet this week, or we could even probably just put into it, but I would think you just canvass the members, and as long as the subcommittee happens this week, then we can issue a report and then see the business of the committee start as soon as possible. I will just say again, Mr. Chair, people expect us to work together, but that also means productively. So let's not get tangled up in knots. Let's get the steering committee to meet this week
And have the ambassador.
No later than
Feb 7th.
February 7th. To me, that is a good
Speaker,
way to have things presented.
Chair, could I ask for, as a point of order, a temporary suspension to the meeting so that we can discuss this sub-amendment to my amendment?
The motion is suspended. The meeting is suspended, pardon me.
Thank you.
often don't understand how often members actually, perhaps when the cameras aren't on or we're not in session, perhaps how members do operate in a collaborative fashion and work things out. It can't always be done, but sometimes it can. And in that spirit, Ms. Alice Love, over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you to all of the colleagues, because sometimes having a logistics background is probably the most difficult part of doing some of these things. So if I could seek unanimous consent to withdraw the motion, the amendment to the motion, and the sub-amendment to the motion, so that I might present a new motion.
Is it agreed?
Okay.
D'accord.
And
Agreed.
then, if I might, the new motion would read that the Subcommittee on Agenda and Procedures meet as soon as possible, and that the committee be briefed by officials prior to the appearance of the Ambassador of Canada to the People's Republic of China, and that the committee invite the Ambassador of Canada to the People's Republic of China, Mr. Dominic Barton, to appear in person before the committee for a 2-hour televised meeting no later than February 7th, 2020, and that Mr. Barton be given 20 minutes to update the committee on the state of relations between Canada and the People's Republic of China, and that the remaining time be allotted for questions and comments from the members of the committee.
Is it agreed? Agreed. On est d'accord.
Thank you very much, guys.
I have Mr. Albus.
Yes, Mr. Chair. I just think it's very important to note that there are 3 members from British Columbia today that made this possible.
Is that because there aren't 250 centimeters of snow in Vancouver, or?
That's how we do things.
Absolutely. Anything? Oh, yes. So we should, among the things, we need to deal with the question of the usual meeting time and the frequency of meetings. I am advised that that 11. Just a second, please. At the time, and a special committee has priority on rooms and being televised. Our 11 to, but we can meet anytime we want to, just to be clear, but we only have priority on these times. 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Mondays, 8:45 a.m. to 10:45 a.m. on Fridays, 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. Monday and Thursday, or Monday to Thursday, 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. Monday to Thursday. Oui, je vais répéter en français, monsieur.
Yes, I'll repeat in French for Mr. Bergeron. What I've said is that the committee may meet when it wishes to. However, we will have priority for televised meetings and for meeting rooms at the following times: 11 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Monday, 8:45 to 10:45 a.m. on Fridays, 5:30 to 7:30 p.m. Monday to Thursday. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday.
Alors, quel est le vouloir?
What is the will of the committee?
Frederick Caddis and then Ms. Alice Litt.
Mr. Chair, I know this is important because we want to know when we'll be working, but we don't have a vice chair, or we do have a vice chair, but one of our vice chairs is not here. So Mr. Harris is not here, and we also are lacking Mr. Workington. So with that in mind, I think this issue is probably best left to the subcommittee, especially since we don't know their schedules, the vice chair's schedules.
Ms. Alice Litt.
So, 2 things. One, I think it's a good idea for the subcommittee to investigate this as well, but perhaps just so that we can all weigh in, because we do need all of our committee members to weigh in on this. We, on the official opposition side, we're thinking that maybe we would meet 1 day a week, but instead of only for 2 hours, perhaps we could consider 3 hours. And so our thought was maybe Monday mornings from 10 until 1, if that were a possibility, and then we are able to still have a sense of urgency, get a fair amount of work done, and still get together and make some progress on that. So that's sort of what we were thinking, but we put it obviously perhaps to the subcommittee to investigate further.
Perhaps we'll have Sunday brunches instead of Sunday suppers. Ms. Blaney at home, sorry.
I agree that this should go to the subcommittee and recognize that there are 2 vice chairs that are not here, and that's an important part. I think the only thing that would be helpful to add is the 10 to 1, the 3 hours would probably work for Mr. Harris, who will be representing the New Democrats. However, one of the questions that I would have is around televised access for the 3 hours. I hope that the subcommittee is given that important information.
Maybe I could answer the question about the television before we go on to the next speaker, who's Mr. Oliphant. But I indicated previously that we had priority over rooms and television from 11 to 1 on Mondays. I presume that it's not difficult to make, if the committee were to decide to make that 10 to 1, that there's no other committees meeting then, so it's not a problem? Yeah, okay. That answers your question, I think. Mr. Oliphant.
I believe there's been some discussion among the whips about this, and I think it should go to the subcommittee. However, we'll just signal that we are in agreement with Mondays from 10 to 1. We think that's a good solution, but subject to 2 vice chairs being consulted. And we're going to be meeting as soon as possible as a subcommittee anyway, so it'll be good. But we are generally in favor of that, subject to their approval.
Thank you. That's useful. Are there other things that we need? Okay, I have Mr. Barrett, and then après ça, Mr. Bergeron.
Mr. Chair, I just, as we lay the markers down for when we're going to be having these meetings and the projected order of business for the committee, I think it's important to note that when we talk about as soon as possible, that means different things to different people, and we've rightly identified that. The work of this committee is urgent because we have Canadians who are illegally jailed in China. It's very important that we understand that today's meeting was the last day that this committee was allowed to have its first meeting as directed by the House. So we give ourselves a timeline, and time goes by quickly, and we find that we've used it all up. And as soon as possible was actually the last possible allowable time to make it happen. Mm-hmm. It's also important to note that we have farmers across Canada who have lost over $1 billion because of the trade actions that China has taken, specifically dealing with canola. So I think it's really important that we're cognizant of that we're mindful of all of the different areas, and there are many, many more that this relationship between Canada and China that are affected. And why it's so important that the important work of this committee is done expeditiously, and that we do give time-bound guidelines to ourselves in directing our work, because it is vital to so many parts of our federation and to its citizens that we act quickly. And so I just ask all members to be mindful of that when we say things like as soon as possible. The spirit, the intent of that, I believe, is good, but I think it's important that we act on that, and we truly do it as soon as possible, because when we just do it at the last date that is allowable, we might not be fulfilling the spirit of the obligation that we have. Thank you.
Mr. Oliphant? I think I said Mr. Albus afterwards. No. Excuse me. Where was... No. Excusez-moi, Mr. Bergeron.
Pardon me, Mr. Bergeron. Mr. Chair, if I understand correctly, our colleague has just come back to the motion that we passed. However, I believe that we were trying to find the times that were the most appropriate for our committee colleagues. I just have a question. Our colleague, while presenting the Conservative proposal to meet from 10 a.m. to 1 p.m. on Mondays, said that we think it's better to meet once rather than twice a week and for 3 hours rather than for 2 hours. It seems to me that 2 times for 2 hours each is more time. Why, therefore, do we prefer to meet once for 3 hours rather than to meet twice for 2 hours each? First question. Second question, when it comes to as soon as possible, I would like to share with you a previous experience that I had. At the time, I was sitting several years ago at the Chamber of Commerce, and we were in contact with representatives from Taiwan who were telling us they wanted to open an office in Montreal soon. However, the notion of soon for a country that has history that goes back millennia does not have the same meaning that for a country that's barely 400 years old. To my knowledge, that office is still not open today in Montreal. I think that the point is entirely relevant. When we say as soon as possible, or as quickly as possible, it must be understood that there has to be a feeling of urgency. We've got Canada's economic interests at play, but also Quebec's economic interests, and there are the lives of at least 2 Canadian citizens that are at issue. Therefore, we need to proceed with all due diligence. However, we've set a deadline for meeting with the ambassador, which is February 7th. If I understand correctly, the ambassador would be able to meet on January 27th, or the 28th of January, which means that the ambassador could meet with us in the following days, such as the 29th or the 30th. But the 29th or the 30th is not a Monday between 10 and 1. I'd like to come back to the question, why is it once for 3 hours rather than twice for 2 hours? Sincerely, I actually prefer twice for 2 hours. I think we'll be able to accomplish more work by meeting twice for 2 hours rather than once for 3 hours.
I'm going to go. Je vais aller maintenant.
I will now go to Mr. Oliphant. If anyone wants to answer the questions raised by Mr. Bergeron, feel free, but the next person on the list is Mr. Oliphant, and after that, Mr. Albus.
I think it would be very appropriate for us to take this discussion now into the subcommittee. I think that everybody will have the opportunity to talk about 2 2s, 1 3s, 3 5s, 2 9s, I don't know what, but I think that we can have a discussion there when people know their committee responsibilities and the other things that are on people's minds. So I actually think it's not going to be productive for us to continue at this time. We've signaled that we think it's a good option. I'm happy to listen to the other parties and try to find collaboration, in the spirit of collaboration, to find times at work. And I just think it would be most helpful if we now took that discussion into that venue and look at the calendar and look at those kinds of things. The subcommittee should look at, a working plan. And maybe we start with 3-hour meetings and then move to 5 evenings in a row. I chaired the special committee on assisted dying. We had to meet every evening. We took every slot from 5:30 to 9 most days to get that work done. So I think that will be something we just need to discuss. With respect to bientôt, or our whole, the way we're working, I actually just wanted on behalf of our side to thank the clerk for putting this meeting together. The parties got you the names at the last minute. One party was, we were late. I think we were pretty good, but parties got the names to you late. You've had logistics to do, putting a special committee together. It's unusual, and wanted to thank you. I know the analysts have been already anticipating our motion, getting work done. I also want to say 2 things. I think we should acknowledge in this room the people of Newfoundland and Labrador, particularly Newfoundland and St. John's and other parts on the eastern side. Jack Harris is not with us today. I think that is a reality of life that we have to be sensitive to. And he was very gracious by saying, and I talked to him about, the possibility of us rescheduling because of that, and it would take a House consent. But that is a reality. The other extreme reality that many of us have faced in our own ridings are the death of 57 Canadians who died in Tehran. And while this committee is important and our relationship with China is important, some of us have been very preoccupied with that. I have a high school mourning in my riding death. I have families mourning in my riding, and that has occupied many of us. And so we are working on this issue, but we don't let the other issues go because our world is complex. Our world is difficult. People's lives are affected by these things. And we are doing, I think having this meeting is not late, it's timely. And I think that the House is managing us well, and we'll do our part to do. And I think every member of this committee will help the clerk and the analysts do your work, so you can help us do our work. And we're getting the date done. So thank you very much.
Mr. Oliphant, I think in respect of your comments in relation to the clerks and the analysts, I think, and I'm sure, I imagine in relation to your concern in relation to the people who are the victims of Flight 752 and their families, I'm sure all members, I think, would join in that view, and I'm seeing agreement on that. And now I have Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Albus.
Sorry,
then
Mr.
myself.
Albus. His name was already crossed off a little early. Okay.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chair. All us BC people look alike, I guess. Terribly. Anyway, so I would just like to focus. Yes, I do take that back. I would just like to focus a little bit on two things. First of all, our member from the Bloc Québécois gets specifically asked about the subcommittee and whether or not that should be viewed in terms that should be deciding our times. I do think that discussion needs to be at the subcommittee. I do think that if we do decide to do with the 10 to 1, since I'm not on the subcommittee, I just want to give my opinion. The 10 o'clock till 1 o'clock, I think, will work. Being from British Columbia, I travel a long distance to be here. I will be here for those, and I think it's a good step for the committee. Second, though, is that if there are exceptional requirements for further meetings at further times, just due to the nature of some of the people that we will be working with, in order to make sure we can accommodate, and again, it's written in the motion, many of the public figures that may need to have different times, I'm prepared to work. Parliament, I think, is prepared to work, and I'd like to see that. I did note today, Mr. Chair, that we were able to come with some unanimous support for my colleague's motion. I think that that's a good first step. But I will say this. If the ambassador, and the member again from Quebec had mentioned that the ambassador will be in North America, or I mentioned earlier it would be Houston on January 28th. If the ambassador can be before making public comments in Houston, or if he's talking and doing his job in North America on the 28th, to me, there's no reason why the ambassador cannot be here within a relative period of time, either before or after. I don't think that we should, as Mr. Barrett earlier said, wait to the very last date. There are a number of issues that are very pertinent, that are sensitive and time sensitive, I should say, Mr. Chair. And if the ambassador, who I have interviewed at committee and have found that he's very capable of dealing with parliamentarians, I don't believe he'll require a lot of time to be briefed up. I think he'll be able to come and be able to give us answers. I do want to push the government to try to make that sooner rather than later, for the good of this committee and for this Parliament's work. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Doherty.
Mr. Chair, I just want to echo, I was going to echo the comments along the lines of Mr. Albus and I'd then bring up what Mr. Bergeron mentioned. If the ambassador is going to be back in North America next week in Houston, there's no reason why he could not be appearing before this committee. we have 2 Canadians that are being detained. And to our colleague across the floor, Lenore's comments, we should be moving forward always with them. We have farmers that can't wait. They have suffered significant losses due to the trade action from this government. And I think as a committee, we should be moving forward, trying to have the ambassador here at his earliest convenience.
Oslev.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I did want to just echo what Mr. Oliphant said about those who were so tragically lost their lives. Unfortunately, my riding was one of the ones that was quite significantly hit, and it has really had a substantive impact on, and I want to send out, I know, on behalf of all of us, if I might, my condolences to everyone that has suffered as a result of this tragedy. So, thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Oslev. Monsieur Bergeron.
Simplement à titre de
Just as a suggestion, perhaps at the end of this committee sessions, perhaps we should have 2 minutes of silence. Yes, perhaps we could observe that now. 2 minutes of silence. 1 minute of silence.
Other matters that okay. Colleagues, I've asked the clerk to reach out to the members of the subcommittee to work out the time as soon as possible for its first meeting. So I hope that can be that can take place very soon. Anything further? Seeing none, I thank the committee for its work today, and this meeting is adjourned.